Thank you very much, Richard, and I hope that everybody can see my slides and hear me talk. Thanks to everybody joining this occasion today. Very happy to be here. As Richard just said, my name is Malte Winkler. I work for Perspectives Climate Group. Perspectives is a research and consultancy firm which is globing internationally with a team of around 70 experts on climate policy at the moment. And what I would like to talk about with you today is the question of how CCUS activities can be governed, covering especially the non-technical issues, social, political, and environmental issues. And for now, I cannot change my slides, unfortunately. It has worked. Here we go. Okay. So just briefly for you to know where we are heading, more or less, this is the agenda. I would first like to spend a few minutes with you to actually give an overview of what CCUS is and what it complies. I'm aware that probably most of you know what it is, but still I want to bring this up again because it is important to understand the complexity of the whole field when we then later turn towards the policy options and the policy considerations. After that, I will give a brief overview on what regulations are there already in Europe that, although they might not be targeted specifically to CCUS, still can play a role for CCUS and still impact how CCUS activities are being carried out or not carried out. After that, we will have a look at what governance dimensions actually should be considered when targeted policies for CCUS are being designed and what this implies, before we then come to a last slide where I sum up and give some take-home messages in the form of conclusions. So first of all, like I said, what actually do we mean when we talk about CCUS? CCUS stands for carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So the title has it already, that this is not one activity that we talk about. It is a whole series, a whole range of value chains that can be used to achieve this goal of capturing and utilizing or storing CO2. And the various steps of this value chains, I will briefly go through them with you. So the first one, obviously, is the capture. Already here, there's some important marks to be made. So first of all, it makes a difference as to where the CO2 is being captured. Is it a point source, for example, in industrial plants where CO2 and other greenhouse gases are often part of the processes that are happening there that are being emitted as process emissions? These can be captured right at the stack at a point source, similar to what is being done already in a couple of applications for power plants. For example, power plants where fossil fuels are being combusted, setting free CO2. This can again be captured at the stack. And also on waste incineration plants where different matter containing carbon is being burned, including but not limited to biogenic waste. And here it already is a distinction that will become important throughout the remainder of my talk, the question of where does the CO2 that is being captured actually come from? Because if we capture, for example, at a point source, fossil fuel emissions, then it is an emission reduction. Whereas if we capture emissions that are coming from biomass that is being burned but has been taken out of the air by that biomass before, then actually under certain circumstances that can be an emission removal. And that is important to understand, that CCUS really covers or can be both of that, a reduction and a removal. Because even more prominently, maybe the next example, when we move from point source CCS toward CO2 capture from the environment, most frequently we talk about from the ambient air. For example, when we have agricultural practices or forests, or also practices in the ocean, like blue carbon management, where biosphere is used to capture CO2 from the air. But also this can be done with technical applications, most prominently probably the direct air capture, DAC, which really with a series, again, different technologies making use of different chemical reactions that take the CO2 out of the air and then allow it to be utilized and stored after that. So the takeaway from this slide is it does matter what CO2 is being captured. Then next in the value chain is the utilization part. Here I make a distinction between the storage time, because depending on how you utilize CO2, it can again play a very different role in the whole set of climate policies that there is. For example, if you use it to be put into beverages or in greenhouses, then it will be very shortly after being captured will be re-emitted, because these applications have a very short storage time typically. Similarly, this holds true also for biofuels or synth fuels and also green hydrogen, where typically the CO2 is put into a fuel that is then being burned, and then the CO2 is re-released, so to say. So this is not a long storage. Whereas on the other hand, one can also utilize CO2 in products that can have or can imply a really durable storage. For example, in some building materials, such as cement and concrete, where it is really, where the CO2 is really part of the chemical compound that we have in the end, where it can theoretically be staying for thousands of years, but also if managed correctly in timber, which is an application where, yeah, obviously the capture is happening via the biosphere, via photosynthesis. It's stored in the timber, and if the timber is then put to use as a building material, it can stay there for a very long time without being re-emitted. Another application that is that I listed here is enhanced oil recovery. It has its own challenges. I'm not going into the details here, but also if this is a potential use case for CO2, where under certain circumstances, once again, this can be a durable storage opportunity. So we have carbon capture and utilization, and on the storage side, again, we can distinguish, for example, between gases, storage of gases, CO2, and of solid carbon. So gases probably is the most prominent one, I would think, because in most of these graphs that you see about CCS and CCU, we see them being stored, for example, in deep saline aquifers or via mineralization in basaltic rock, which also is important in terms of the permanence of the storage, because in some of these applications, if nothing goes wrong, this is really a permanent storage opportunity. Permanent meaning really geological timescales, talking about tens of thousands of years, which is of course very different to storing CO2, for example, or not storing, to utilizing CO2 in beverages. A completely different outcome in the end. On the other hand, we have also ways to store solid carbon that has been captured before. Often this is the case if it has been stored in biomass, for example, in biochar applications, or once again, like I said before, on the utilization, timber can serve as a permanent storage option, as long as a real carbon cycle is being built around that use of timber as a building material. Now we have carbon capture, utilization, and storage covered, but there's one more important aspect, being the transport. In most of the cases, the CO2 has to be transported between capture and utilization or storage on the other. And this can happen in different ways, for example, via train, roads, and ships on the one hand, which is of course relatively small scale means of transport compared to large scale applications such as a pipeline, which of course imply a large upfront cost that needs to be realized if one wants to do that. But then in the end, if we go to a large scale usage of CCUS, then this will be on the long term the cheaper option. And here again, you already can imagine that this plays a role in determining what policies and what policy instruments will be deployed to get to this point. So to sum this up, I wanted to make sure that it is clear to everybody that CCUS is a complex issue. It covers multiple steps in multiple value chains, potentially. It covers different industrial sectors and thereby also different actors and power groups and stakeholders. And it is a whole range of different technologies at each of these steps in the value chain. So it's really a big thing, not just we talk about CCUS and it's one thing that we want to focus on, but it's really a whole range of applications, which of course also makes governance of it complex and asks for a multitude of decisions to be made before implementing one or another governance system for CCUS. And that is determined by the overall policy objectives. So I will turn to that later in my talk. The questions like what role should CCUS actually play in policy? Should we see it as a resource, as emission reduction, as an emission removal, or in the short term only a delay of emissions? So this will drive what policies and what policy instruments will be used and will be helpful to get us from where we are now to this stated policy objectives. I thought about doing a diagram of all this, but I then feared it might look like this in the end, so I refrained from it. So this is just a random, very complex diagram, but I am pretty certain that if I try to do a diagram of CCUS covering all the aspects I mentioned, it would look similar. So I decided not to go into that rabbit hole. So now that we have an understanding of what CCUS is and how complex it is, I would like to briefly guide you through the actual status of CCUS governance in Europe, because although it is a relatively new development that we talk about CCUS as much as we do now, there's already quite some legislation in place which might not be targeted to govern CCUS, but still is relevant for CCUS. And we will now briefly go through this. Now, when we talk about Europe, of course, we have a somewhat special situation because we always have different levels of governance, being the international level on the one, then on the two, we have the EU level, where of course the EU is putting out lots of regulations, and then we have the member state level. So that's already here again a relatively complex setting with three different levels of legislation to keep in mind. And we start now with a brief overview on what is out there in the international law. Most of it, the ones are listed here, are dealing with CO2 as a potential polluter in the marine environment. So, for example, the London Protocol and the London Convention deal with how CO2 can or cannot be dumped in the sea. The Barcelona and Helsinki conventions take this a bit further for certain areas of important European water bodies, but as you see, both of them also have reached out to regions outside of the EU. So this is also international legislation again here, and most prominently maybe the UNCLOS, the Convention on the Law of the Sea, which deals with among other the protection of biodiversity and pollution in the open waters that are not part of exclusive economic zones of any state, but are really international waters. That is covered, or some aspects of CCUS are already covered in this convention. Moving to EU legislation next. A lot has happened in recent times in the EU regarding CCUS. There are a couple of regulations and directives which I listed here that in one way or the other are important and play a role to how CCUS can be deployed and can be incentivized also. So we have, as a recent development, the carbon removal and carbon farming regulation that basically sets a standard for most, if not all, CCUS applications and technologies, and it sets a standard to make sure that if we want to use CCUS as a policy objective in the EU, these standards should be met. However, this regulation so far does not at all address the question of where demand for this for these certified CCUS activities should come from. So it is setting a standard, but it does not create any demand and thereby not create any real incentivization to do CCUS. Similarly, setting targets and time frames of when to achieve what rates of carbon capture, utilization, and storage in different industry sectors are the Net Zero Industry Act, the Industrial Carbon Management Strategy, and then we have already for a couple of years the CCS directive that directly deals with many of the aspects that are important to a lot of the CCUS activities that I talked about. And we have the EU emission trading system, the ETS directive, under which, again, many CCUS activities are already falling, albeit with little success, meaning that it hasn't led to very much growth in the CCUS sectors, so to say. So it doesn't set in sufficient demand for CCUS simply because at this point the price levels are not high enough to really incentivize doing CCUS. And for most of the biospheric-based CCUS activities, the LULUCF regulation will be of importance, regulating obviously things like agroforestry, forestry, agriculture, and so forth. So you see that's already quite a lot out there, although most of it is not directly targeted at CCUS, but it regulates certain aspects of it. And then coming to the national level, this is really now just a glimpse, of course. In each member state, there may be certain regulations and certain developments also going on. I just put a few examples here that I think are noteworthy because they really make some difference and could be steps, large steps towards a larger scale application of CCUS. First of all, with a Swedish reverse auctioning scheme, specifically targeting BECCS. This is really, I think, the most prominent example for a distinct and targeted policy instrument dealing with one value chain of the big sphere of CCUS activities. We have a group of countries that have signed papers showing that they want to jointly pioneer geological storage of CO2. Storage will become, or might become, if the scale up is happening, might become a very important issue, might create a bottleneck if insufficient storage opportunities are being developed in time, well ahead of the demand. So these countries already are planning into that direction to ensure that once the storage options and opportunities are needed, that they are available. And then lastly, countries developing strategies as to how CCUS or carbon management should be implemented in their overarching climate strategies. For example, the carbon management strategies in France, Germany, and Austria, and also in Germany going a step further towards negative emissions. Germany is currently developing a long-term strategy for negative emissions. To sum this up, we see that there's already quite a few regulations and also targets out there which are relevant to CCUS in the EU at various governance levels, international, EU, and national. And in recent years, as I said, it is also clearly gaining momentum. This whole policy process is gaining momentum, and more debates are really circling about the CCUS topics and the ambitious target setting of the EU Commission does its own to further foster these discussions. So broadly speaking, where we stand at the moment is, so to say, in the starting blocks of building a functional incentivization landscape for CCUS activities. And this will bring me to the next part of the presentation, because it is, of course, one thing to put out a target and a target year for certain amounts of, for example, stored carbon or emission removals in a certain country. But it is the next step, and not an easy step, to go from there to actually designing the policies and utilizing the policy instruments that are best suited to bring us from where we are now towards this target. And this is what I will talk about for the remainder of this presentation. So very generally speaking, when designing any sort of policies, there's always a multitude of dimensions that should be considered that are often related to social, economic, political, and legal aspects of a certain field. As I showed you in the beginning of this presentation, CCUS is a very diverse and complex issue because it's not one thing, but very many things, and very many sectors and actors are directly or indirectly touched by decisions that are being made in the policy realm. So for CCUS policies, this is particularly important to really make sure that unwanted side effects are being avoided and the actual policy objectives are met in the best possible ways. And in addition to that, it's noteworthy again that at least some of these governance dimensions are specific to CCUS, or more precisely to some CCUS value chains and or technologies. For example, those questions revolving around permanence or the risk of mitigation deterrence. In this context, I would like to put forward a paper that we wrote with a couple of colleagues where we try to map these governance principles indicating these different dimensions. I'd like to mention in this paper, we talk about CDR, so emission removals, not about CCS, which can also, as I said in the beginning, be emission reductions. But I think that most of these governance principles that are being put together and discussed in this article are also important for most of the CCUS applications that can be thought of. Here you see a list of all these dimensions. We will not go through it now one by one. I just wanted to share it with you as a resource if at any point you would like to go back to have a look at what we have there. So this is what we came up with, and you see already that it's quite a lot of aspects that are being covered here. And you can imagine that this is not making things much easier for the decision makers and policymakers. This is basically another way of portraying these issues. It's a map of non-technical issues related to CCUS that was developed within the CCUS ZEN project. Again, you see it's a long list covering different aspects, social, political, then of course economic considerations, legal considerations that I talked about today, and then one big block that I do not cover in great detail in this talk today, but which in itself could be another seminar series, I guess, is the question of MRV and accounting of CCUS activities. So a lot of questions that are related to the policy making and the regulation and governance of these activities. Now, I've showed you how complex the governance of CCUS can be. Now I would like to briefly point out what this implies for where we stand at the moment. Like I said, we stand now, or what is happening now is that incentivization schemes are started to be developed and deployed. And I think many players are in the starting blocks, so to say. We are waiting, so to say, for CCUS to take off and to take the next step. But nonetheless, I would like to highlight that it will be important that policy takes the time to really make sure they are aware of what they want to achieve with CCUS and what role it should actually play in the overarching climate policy. Because as I said in the beginning already, it can play very different roles. Do we want to bring those CCUS applications forward that aim at an emission reduction, for example, point source capture at fossil fuel power plants, or do we want to use it as a removal rather, for example, by fostering really the research in, for example, DAX technologies and really making sure that these technologies become cheaper and are available at a large scale at some point in time. And quite obviously, this is any of what I list now on the next slides is not an either or question, but these are typically questions about what shares do we want, how do we weight these different activities. But it is important to define that because this implies how to govern basically and what to govern. Related to the permanence issue, I've mentioned it already a couple of times. The question, do we want to aim at short-term effects versus long-term effects? Do we, for example, say it is worthwhile delaying an emission for a few days or months or years? Or is this not what we aim for? We aim for permanent storage. Then we would need to have a different governance system that ensures that permanent storage opportunities are available and so forth. And last but not least, the question, so to say, between storage and utilization. Do we want to capture CO2 to have it as a resource in some production processes where we can really utilize it? Or is it, and this is probably most likely, a mitigation measure? Again, this would have different implications on how policies should be designed, depending on which of these is the key objective and how these are weighted. And following from that, once that is clear, so to say, which is in itself probably a long process, is the question of which value chains or which technologies actual policy instruments should focus on. What should we incentivize now? What can we incentivize later? How do we structure this? And when doing that, what interfaces should we consider? When talking about interfaces, I mean, for example, the interfaces between sectors that might be involved in certain value chains, or also talking about the different legislative levels, national versus EU versus international law, which need to be considered here when we try to specifically design policy instruments targeting certain aspects of certain CCUS value chains. And along with that is a fundamental question, so to say, if we want to have certain objectives that really aim at certain technologies that would then require a very specific incentivization of specific activities in that value chain, or if we want to establish a framework that ensures that CCUS is being done in as many activities as possible. As, for example, now we have, I would say, mitigation basically is can be an example where
climate mitigation is really a part of very many sectors, and it is required from almost every aspect in our or in the society to help to mitigate. This could also be an approach for CCUS, but this is, of course, again, very different to targeted interventions looking at specific technologies. And again, I'm repeating this is probably not an either or, but a both and a question of where to focus on for now. And related to that, this balancing will be important also when the governance dimensions that I showed you are being considered in the policy design process. You can imagine we have a whole long list. You can imagine that this is not always easy to cater for them all, so to say. There are, of course, contradictions and aspects where one would have to wait. What is the most important dimensions? What is, again, the key focus, the key objective of what the policy is aimed at, and what dimensions cannot play the role they would probably also deserve, but there has to be a weighting to be done. And this is very much dependent, again, on the overall policy objective that is being pursued, and also regional circumstances, for example. And building on all these questions, these are, of course, not all the questions that are important, but I think these are the ones that must be asked before starting to actually design policy instruments. Following from these questions would be the question, which policies and which policy instruments are actually suited and should be used to incentivize the different CCUS activities or value chains that policy aims at fostering. There is, again, a whole set of policy instruments available to incentivize CCUS activities. For example, this could be based on carbon markets, most prominently maybe the EU ETS, where CCUS is already part of, but it's not sufficiently incentivized to actually bring up the projects. Voluntary carbon markets, especially in the international voluntary carbon markets, for example, Article 6 of the Paris Agreements, can become really important here. But then also, apart from these carbon markets, we have the option to use regulation and standards. We have the option to subsidize certain activities, to penalize certain activities via taxes. The voluntary agreements can play a role. And last not least, information instruments can be important to make sure that CCUS perception in the public is truthful and is not biased on false information, basically. And it is important to understand that each of these instruments functions in a different way and has its own characteristics when it comes to the governance dimensions that I mentioned before. So, for example, a top-down regulation can be very climate effective in enforcing certain CCUS targets, for example, but it might be very unjust. I'm putting this a bit black and white now. Whereas if we talk about information instruments, these may have hard to measure outcomes because it's a relatively blurry process, and it's hard to really measure the direct way from the information instrument to the actual amount of CCUS that is being realized. But nonetheless, it can play a big role, and it can serve other governance dimensions that are served less, for example, by the top-down regulation. And here, these kind of discussions become important when policies are actually being designed. And in that sense, an important aspect is to understand that there is no silver bullet solution, neither for CCUS activities or value chains, simply because they have very different outcomes eventually. And there's also no silver bullet solution when we talk about governing it, because, like I said, there are different policy options, different instruments that can serve
different policy objectives. And with that, I come to my take-home messages. What I hope that you will remember tonight still from this talk is the fact that CCUS is a complex thing, not only in terms of value chains, but also in terms of the non-technical issues related to it. That there is already quite an established regulatory framework in the EU on different legislative levels, in the national, the regional, and the international components are part of it. And that at this point in time, the governance in the EU and its member states is developing at a relatively high pace. So the next step, and what is happening and will be happening in the next years, is that policy instruments are being designed to really incentivize certain aspects of this CCUS cosmos, so to say. We have a set of governance dimensions that cover very many non-technical issues, and these will have to be weighted when policies are being designed. So it's important to understand what the policy actually shall achieve, what the objectives are, also in the large picture, what the targets are, what value chains, technologies are going to be addressed by certain policies, and eventually which risks are we willing to take also as a society. And following directly from that, the fact that we will need a whole portfolio of policy instruments to ensure that we make, as a society again, the best use of the available CCUS technologies. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, for your participation. If you have any questions that will not be answered now in the Q&A session, I'm very happy if you write me an email. I'll put my address on here. So yeah, happy to keep in touch. Please approach me if you want to further discuss that. And with this, I would unshare my screen and hand over to you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Maite, for your talk. It was very, very, very clear, very well structured as well. I hope everyone agrees, certainly those who have clapped. What we're going to do just now is, again, you can still submit your text questions if you wish to. What I'll do is I will allow the microphone for attendees and the cameras for attendees. So just if anyone does have burning questions for Maite, please use the hand raising feature on Teams, and we'll be able to answer the questions in the order they come in. But we'll essentially address to anyone who does raise their hand. Then you'll have a power over your own microphone and camera, so we can see you and we can hear you. So I'll give a couple of minutes just to see if anyone has any questions for Maite. Well, in the meantime, I do have one question, Maite, from myself. In your conclusion, you mentioned different governance dimensions to be weighted, and I just wondering if there's suggestions, practices in place to actually decide, prioritize in any way how to weigh these, how to build a sequence perhaps of things that need to be put in place, or if there's examples out with Europe that can be considered and taken as models.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Richard. So when talking about these dimensions, I think there are a few usual suspects, so to say. Typically, efficiency would play a role. Efficiency, for example, in terms of mitigation potential and realized mitigation potential. So options that can realize a high amount of mitigation one way or the other at a relatively low price, they might be targeted first. And like I said in my talk, this also goes to the choice of instrument. a regulation that comes top down might be relatively easy to establish and ensure that there's a push in the deployment of certain technologies. So this would be an example. However, especially I think in climate policy, the question of burden sharing is also an important one, which can, when we talk about regulation or also carbon tax, it has been widely discussed that the burden sharing is not necessarily ideal when we have these top-down instruments. So, for example, the discussion that was prevalent a couple of years ago, or maybe even decades ago, about whether a carbon tax should be favored over an emission trading system deals exactly with these two dimensions. A carbon tax has to be paid by anybody emitting, whereas an emission trading system allows for trading so that the mitigation happens where it is the cheapest, which is both efficient and fair, because people can make players in the field can make a decision whether they want to mitigate or they want to buy a certificate. So this also goes into that discussion about which dimensions to focus on. And talking about sequencing of policies, I think this is very important to have in mind. For example, I mentioned that the EU ETS actually already covers CCS as part of it. However, we do not see that CCS is really taking off simply by being covered under the EU ETS. So one might consider that certain technologies could be led into the EU ETS, into bringing it to price levels where it can compete with other mitigation options under the EU ETS artificially, meaning by targeted policy instruments again. Let me give you an example. We talk about, for example, direct air capture being part of the EU emission trading scheme. And there will the price levels of the ETS and the DAC are really very different. So we might, for example, want to come up with carbon contracts for difference that ensure the DAC providers that they have the levels of funding that they need to develop their technologies and already be in the emission trading system, ensuring a relatively robust demand side for their DAX activities. So this could be building on CCFD, carbon contracts for difference, to have it then in the EU ETS eventually. So this would be an example for policy sequencing. I'm not saying that this is the ideal case or that I want to propose this as a good option. I'm just talking about options here.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Maite. We do have a question also in the chat. I'll go ahead and read it out. How do governments accelerate implementation of regulations for permanent storage of CO2? It seems most of the policies and regulations we talk about here incentivize the entry point, emissions and capture, but storage segment is still poorly regulated and needs to catch up. There are still a number of countries in Europe that have not legalized yet underground storage of CO2.
Yeah, I agree. Like I said, available storage volume might become a bottleneck actually. And I agree that in many countries, for my country, Germany, it's certainly true that so far it's simply not allowed to store CO2. However, in Germany, the discussion is being opened and it's expected that this will change. So I think policy in general, or policymakers in general, have there is a general understanding that we need these activities, that we do need both reductions from CCS activities and also removals eventually. And we see in the policy development that this is gaining pace, that this is really moving. But I think patience will be needed, especially when we come from the smaller scale legislation to larger. This simply takes time. And I showed this one example of countries that are now grouping together to pioneer future storage opportunities. But this is, of course, only a first step. We have a few actual storage projects that have been working for a couple of years already, and mainly in Norway and in Iceland. But these are really first steps. And yeah, the question of how to accelerate this pace, I think the only way is to put it on the agenda again and again, and to ensure that policymakers follow this first step of setting targets by really implementing now this incentivization schemes that I talked about. So I think it is happening. How to get it even faster is to put it higher on the agenda, and that, yeah, will happen by basically lobby groups, the public. If they give attention to this topic, I would argue that probably politicians will follow in designing then these policies that are required.
Excellent, thank you. A reminder, you can all use the hand raising function as well if you want to chip in as well, or have any other questions. There's one more in the chat. They would like to get your thoughts on the next steps for the German CMS in particular, and how it compares to other national and EU strategies. Perhaps that might be related a little bit to previous question of certain countries not accelerating in sort of similar rates.
Yeah, I fear I have to pass on that one. I'm not an expert on national legislation so much. Yeah, I don't want to now put out any claims that might not be true. Sorry about that. It's not my field of expertise, really, these national differences between member states. I hope that's fine.
And then any thoughts on specific to Germany, I suppose, next steps or German CMS in particular, if it's not necessarily comparing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes again into the same direction, that it's a strategy setting out basically where we want to end up and what goals we want to fulfill, but it doesn't really imply yet how we get there in terms of instruments, in terms of incentivization. So it's the strategy aims at tackling some of the questions that I raised. So what are the important technologies? What are the objectives? So that is a good first step. But coming from here, this will need to be poured into actual policy instruments. And I guess this is the next steps that will come and that will follow in the next years. So I think it is a very important initiative that this is happening, because it tackles some of these underlying questions that need to be asked now. And following from that will most likely come the design of policy instruments that then lead to Germany fulfilling these targets that are outlined in the strategy.
Thank you, Maite. We still have questions. There's one that's come in the chat. What EU carbon price forecast do you use for the economic evaluations? So EIB shadow cost of carbon, which is on the high side, versus current other commercial forecast providers' estimates.
Okay, so we don't do actual economic forecasts on when the price will be where or used. I mean, I think all these measures that you mentioned, they show into the same direction. And that is for this qualitative analysis that we are doing is the important thing to understand. So we are not focusing on one source or the other, but look at the general development that has been going on in recent years, and that is going to be most likely, and following these projections, being continued in the next years.
Thank you. We still have time for a few questions. If there's anyone who would like to submit additional ones. Sorry, I've clicked my own hand raising there. Yeah, you can raise your hand. You can submit text questions. I'll take the opportunity in the meantime to mention that this is the third on the webinar the third in the series of webinars. That includes 5 webinars focusing on work packages, plus a 6th webinar focusing on a sort of a roundup for the project, which ends at the beginning of next year, February, March time. So there will be another couple of webinars, webinar 4 and 5, which will focus respectively on work packages 3 and 4. And those will take place in November and December. And then we'll have a final webinar. So please, please do. I popped in the chat the link to the events page on our website. So keep an eye on that, and we'll share with everyone once those are available for registration. Any other questions from anyone? We'll give it a couple of minutes. Okay. Well, if there's any additional questions that we didn't have time, and anything that as soon as we close up you think of, Maite did put in his email address in the last slide. You can see that back on the recording of the webinar. But if there's no further questions, all there is for me to say is thank you very much to Maite for, I agree, a very insightful presentation, and for taking the time to answer some of the questions in the webinar. And we look very much forward to welcoming you back for another webinar for the project. So thank you, Maite, and thanks everyone for joining. Have a great rest of the afternoon.
Great session. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you for the invitation, and thank you all for listening.
Cheers. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.